You're on.
Wait. Actually, All right. Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing? Great concert and great whatever masterclass with Space Pants this morning. I'd say really cool. So I'm going to, well, actually, before I start, let me just, I thought about what I should do, what I should talk about or present. And I kind of decided to, I have several different presentations, each of which could fill the entire time. So I'm going to kind of I decided to do abbreviated versions of different talks or presentations because they all sort of connect. And they connect to right now, like where we are. And I don't mean sitting in front of our computer screens. I mean where we are in the world today. Okay, let me share screen. You can all see this, right?
Yes.
I hear no response, so I take that as a yes.
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 Actually, I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces, but more importantly, how they tie into what I'm feeling these days. And that is overwhelmed. You know, the question that pops into my mind is this: who cares about my sax quartet? Who cares about my solo violin piece? Do you know what I mean? I mean, when in the society, in the world today, when everything is going on, pandemic and BLM and corruption in the White House, and that's just like the start. At times, I can kind of get frozen and question my role and importance of what I'm doing. So I'm going to talk about some recent pieces, completed and in progress. Let me actually shift. Blah, 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 blah. The first thing I thought I'd talk about is a pretty big piece, an oratorio called Zealot Canticles. And, I have several different titles for this presentation. One is Zealot Canticles, an oratorio for tolerance, but it could also be titled Agitprop. Sound familiar? That was the title of the Transient Canvas concert and the title of the piece of mine that they did. Agitprop, the role of music and the composer in turbulent times. Well, in other words, I can't concentrate. My mind is completely distracted. I'm overwhelmed by the daily barrage of news about the latest mass shooting, the latest horrific national or world event, the latest racist, sexist, offensive, or stupid tweet from whoever, really, but, certain tweets are more offensive and stupid than others. The latest police shooting of an unarmed Black person, the latest White House scandal or corruption. My mind and soul are filled with sadness, depression, frustration, and rage. It's constant, okay? It can feel overwhelming. So how in the heck can I compose? How can I create under these circumstances? I feel artistically paralyzed. Here's a pretty important and powerful quote by Wole Soyinka. Yes, intolerance has become, I think, the reigning ideology of the world today. Intolerance versus intolerance. And it's, okay, wait, hold on. Not intolerance versus tolerance, okay? Intolerance versus tolerance, that would be a problem, right? That's a problem. What's worse than intolerance versus tolerance? Intolerance versus intolerance. And it's taken on lethal proportions. Some brief background. Zealot Canticles was commissioned by The Crossing. Now, if you all aren't familiar with The Crossing, you need to immediately become so. They are probably the premier professional choir in America at the moment. Certainly one of the top 3 best in the country and one of the top in the world. And Donald Nally is their director. And they're absolutely amazing, fantastic musicians. And not everything, but I would say a good 80%. It's not 50%. It's a good 80% of what they do, the rep that they program, the programs that they put together, the commissions that they do, have to do with, cause. Socio-political, environmental, economic, racial justice, what have you. So that's really kind of their main, mission statement, to do great music, and at a top tier level that speaks not just to our ears, but to our world. I won't go into the details of how the commission came about, but I've been so fortunate to work with The Crossing many times now. They've commissioned me, I want to say 4 times. The commission was for a large-scale piece for soloists. So there's soprano, mezzo, and baritone soloists, choir, string quartet, and clarinet. And it's an oratorio for tolerance. Or maybe it's a choral cantata on zealotry. What's the difference? Does it matter? What's the difference between an oratorio and a cantata? Give me some feedback.
An oratorio tends to be more like of a plot heavy, whereas a cantata doesn't necessarily need to be so thematic.
Okay.
An oratorio.
So it would have to do with, a through line, a plot, a story, if you will. Okay.
An oratorio more has a religious context, whereas I don't really see a cantata. It maybe can have that, but really the intention of an oratorio is to have, in the original sense, to have a religious context.
Sure. Okay. That's also often, maybe even usually true. Oratorios are usually of a sacred nature, religious or, biblical text or something else like that. Cantatas are often also, spiritual or religious, but there are many, secular cantatas, even going back to Bach. Any other thoughts? Well, here's a list of, never mind the Baroque and classical oratorios and cantatas, of which there are dozens, if not hundreds. Well, there are hundreds. Here's just some more contemporary, meaning 20th century to the present oratorios and cantatas. Some early ones, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Bartok, Schoenberg, but also more recent ones, John Adams and Sarajevo, Stockhausen. And you can see that, a lot of those oratorios are sacred, but they're not all. And the cantatas, some music history courses or textbooks say that, well, really when it comes down to it, it's a matter of scope. So it's that the big difference between oratorio and cantata is not the subject matter, it's really the scope, duration, and forces. So oratorios are just bigger, right? They can be almost like unstaged operas, whereas cantatas tend to be shorter. But then you look at like Schoenberg's Lieder, which he classifies as a cantata, and it's bigger than any of the oratorios, listed here. So what does this mean? Really, it means that it does not matter, whatever. The interesting thing, though, is that I titled the piece an oratorio for tolerance, and Donald Nally, who commissioned the piece and premiered it, he didn't think it was an oratorio. He thought it was a choral cantata. So he prefers to call it a choral cantata on zealotry. So, maybe it's just a matter of semantics. The commission was for, I already told you the forces, and text by Wole Soyinka. So Donald Nally said, we want to want you to write us a piece on Wole Soyinka. And I said, sure. Of course, I had no idea who Wole Soyinka was. So I immediately did my research, and actually it ended up being about, this whole project, by the way, was almost 7 years in the making. So I took 18 months to create the libretto. Who is Wole Soyinka? Well, he is a Nobel Prize winning author, poet, a novelist, playwright, but he's also a lifelong humanitarian and human rights activist. Imagine, without going into too much detail, he ended up spending several years in prison in very harsh circumstances in Nigeria for speaking out against genocide and the Civil War. He did a hunger strike. He was in solitary confinement. He wrote poetry and part of a novel in prison under amazing circumstances, smuggling in pens, making his own writing utensils, writing on small pieces of paper, which he would have to roll up and hide in the cracks of the prison cell so the guards wouldn't find it. I mean, it's just really an incredible story. He's sort of like if a Nelson Mandela type figure, if Nelson Mandela had also been a Nobel Prize winning author. So one word, libretto, or more like libretto, like when a piece, you can write a 5 or 10 or 15 minute vocal work, whether it's a choral work or a voice and piano or a song cycle, pretty quickly in terms of like dealing with the text or choosing your text. But in a 90-minute oratorio, libretto becomes a big deal. When you're also faced with a large-scale piece, you have to think about form, dramatic structure, story, and concert-length work. When Donald commissioned the piece, he said, we want a concert-length work. And I said, sure, like 50, 60 minutes. And he said, no, I mean concert-length work, like 70, 80, 90 minutes. So that put me back on my heels a little bit because I had never written a piece, that was 80, 90 minutes long. And it's a whole different endeavor than writing a 4 or even 14 or even a 24-minute piece. The initial plan was to set these 12 canticles for the Zealot. That was a collection of 12 poems written by Soyinka in 2002 that deal with zealotry. Now, and this is drawn from Soyinka's personal experience. He shares that, he grew up in a small village in Nigeria where Muslims and Christians and Igbo, the African religion, people lived side by side. And guess what? They didn't kill each other. And he laments that era in Nigeria and really in much of the world is over. I mean, it's just straight up over. In the village he grew up, there are not Christians and Muslims and the Igbo religion people living side by side in peace. No, it's not. It's intolerance has taken over so that, yes, there's Muslim people, but they live over here. And the Christians live over there. And they persecute each other, and they're intolerant of each other. And so this is all drawn from his own personal experience, as well as being, of course, imprisoned. What's amazing about and compelling about these poems is that it's very easy. It would be easy to write poems that say, intolerance bad, right? Zealotry bad. But that's not art. That's just propaganda, even if the propaganda is correct. In his work, he paints a much more nuanced, subtle, even at times empathetic view of zealotry, so that it's very complicated. And sometimes you're reading the poetry and you're horrified, and then other times you realize all of a sudden you catch yourself relating to the zealot. Because zealotry, and this is something that we could talk about for the next 90 minutes, but it's complicated, isn't it? There's all sorts of different types of zealotry. I mean, there are, Hindu or Buddhist monks who live in total peace. They don't persecute anyone. That's a type of zealotry. Or nuns who devote their lives to, Christ or whatever. Well, that's certainly a type of zealotry. People are, we respect those who are zealots, fighting against racism or fighting for equality or for a justice or whatever. So we can't just condemn zealotry outright. It's, well, what is the type of zealotry and what are the results and what are their actions? I had enough text with these 12 poems, but once I really started working on the piece, I realized, well, what's the story? What's the through line? What's going to carry a listener, not for 18 minutes, but for 80 minutes? And I realized that these poems don't work. Just setting 12 poems, even if I could add it up to 80 minutes, doesn't do anything. And in fact, it's boring. The listener will just start, as poetry, it works. As drama in the mind, when you're reading, it works, but not in an 80-minute piece of music. So I spent, a year reading and researching basically every single thing that Soyinka had ever said or written. And I ended up crafting a libretto that was a combination of the Zealot Canticles, as well as other poems and excerpts from plays, novels, interviews, speeches, lectures. And I crafted this all together into an arc that actually had a dramatic direction. There's sort of a narrative. I ended up choosing 19 texts from 10 different sources by different publishers, different sources. Side note, permission, hell. I had a conversation with one of you in a lesson the other day about getting permissions to set text. You don't write a quarter note until you have permission to set the text. I mean, that I cannot emphasize that enough. So I had to spend months. Here's just a list of all the sources, and you can see that they're from interviews, they're from poems, they're from lectures, they're from speeches, articles in journals, in New England Journal of Public Policy, novels. And then, I had to approach, first of all, you have to, if you find something online, usually these days, it's not cited correctly. And you can't just say, hey, I found this really cool poem online, I'm going to set it. Oh, I need permission, I'll contact the website. Because 9 times out of 10 now, whoever put it on their website, whether it's a blog or whatever, they don't have permission. And they didn't even have permission to put it on their website in the first place. So you have to track down, well, who has the permission? Is it the publisher? Is it a literary agent? What if a poem is published in 3 different sources by different publishers? Who do I approach? Sometimes you can approach one publisher, ask for permission to set the poem. They say no. And then instead of being rejected, you go to a different publisher and say, hey, can I set this poem? And they'll say yes. So it's extremely complicated. That's just kind of a side thing. Before I wrote a note, I engaged in this sort of, and this is, I often do this, even for shorter pieces, in making a sort of formal schematic, a blueprint, if you will, of the piece. So I, took, as I said, 18 months to craft this libretto. So I knew I had 20 different texts, which would be 20 different movements. There is a line in the novel that Soyinka wrote when he was imprisoned. He writes this short phrase several times in the book, and that is, I need nothing, I desire nothing, and I feel nothing. So it's basically a renunciation. And for him, it was a way of self-defense, because if you're imprisoned and you want food, you desire food, and then either you deny it or they deny it, either way, you're suffering. If you desire to, a view, if you desire, freedom or what have you, and it's denied you, then you suffer. But if you can convince yourself, you know what, I don't desire anything, I don't need anything, I don't feel anything, all of a sudden that empowers you. It frees you. And it's also a sort of FU to the the guards and whoever's imprisoning you, because they can no longer take something away from you because you don't need it. So that line, I feel nothing, I want nothing, I desire nothing, happens 3 times in the course of the oratorio, right at the beginning and at the end, and then about 2/3 of the way. He also, in a separate work, writes a phrase meaning sort of peace or God be with you in 6 different languages and religions. And so that happens in the twice. I don't want to, I can get kind of stuck in the weeds here, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but Demosthenes was a famous orator from about 2,000 years ago, who was very outspoken and condemned corruption and spoke out against the misuse, abuse of power. So he has a poem kind of as if he's quoting Demosthenes, and I broke it into 4, and it's really sort of like the angry, violent music. and this is one of the keys to the libretto, or to the whole piece really, is that I decided, rather than just setting poems and novels and creative words of Soyinka, that I would quote Soyinka himself, so that he's inserted into the piece, almost as a narrator. And then right in the middle of the piece, the only time you actually hear the words of the zealot. And I'll come back to that. And then I had to figure out, well, when is the clarinet going to, what's the clarinet going to do? Where's it going to appear? And I had kind of this dramatic sketch of a shape. And then I ended up including the 6 of the 12 canticles. Okay, so why do I show you this? Because this that you see before you, this had to be done. It wasn't sort of optional or something I did after the fact. In my opinion, this document here had to be done before I wrote any music at all. I simply do not understand people who dive in to writing a piece. I don't care if it's a 6-minute solo violin piece or a 2-hour opera. If you don't have a clear picture of formal and dramatic structure, and really this transcends style. I don't care if you're a minimalist composer or a post bang in a can or a spectral composer or an avant-garde noise composer or whatever. If you don't know where you're going, what you're building, then I think you're lost. I certainly would be. So this all existed before I wrote any music. So really, it took me 18 months. That's a year and a half. And then I could start composing. And what does that mean? Well, what it really means is that, 18 months of working on libretto and form, that is composing. We often think like, what's composing? Oh, that's when you have the paper and the pencil and you start writing notes, or if you're writing in Finale or Sibelius or what have you. No, yeah, or yes, that is part of composing. But if you're thinking about a piece and trying to envision it, how it's going to work and what it's doing, that's also composing. I'm just going to blast through this. Things to consider. What are the roles of the singers, of the choir, of the instrumental, the instruments? What's the drama? How to set prose or, interviews and speeches versus poetry, because it's a very different type of language. How to avoid predictable settings and telling the audience what to think or how to think. And this is what I mean. Let's say you have a text, and this goes for even if you're writing a 4.5-minute song for soprano and piano. Let's say you have a text and it's really sort of upbeat and really filled with joy. So what does a composer do? You write music that's like upbeat and full of joy. Well, okay, great. But isn't that really predictable? I mean, isn't that just absolutely predictable? And does the audience really need your music if they can already read a poem that's like, upbeat and joyful? Do they need your music to tell you that? I don't really think so. Or if you have an angry poem and then you write angry music, or if you have a melancholic poem and then you write lonely music. I mean, all that can be very effective, but can also be really predictable and boring. Time and temporality. This could be another 90-minute talk. For those of you who don't know the work of Jonathan Kramer, it's absolutely must read. I have my freshmen, dive into this, even though it's pretty heady stuff. And just thumbnail is that, he was a composer and a theorist who's most known for his work about time and temporality and how it works in music. And in that, time can, a 3-minute piece takes exactly 3 minutes, right? 60 seconds in music, how long does it take? 60 seconds. But why is it that 60 seconds can feel like 40 seconds or it can feel like 90 seconds? And what about time, events that happen in music or in poetry or in a play or in a 30-minute sitcom that are displaced so that things can flow in a chronological way and yet not be happening strictly chronologically. So I think about that basically, all the time. It ended up winning a Grammy last year, and the recording. I'm going to share several movements with you. You can see this, right? Yes?
No.
No, I
It's
can't.
just black.
It says end of slideshow.
Oh, okay, that's not good. Hold on. Boom. I think I need to share screen, that's it. You can see that?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, it's a huge piece. It's 84 minutes or something. So I'm just going to select several different movements. I'm going to start with actually the very first movement, and I'm showing you the text here. He wakes from a prolonged delirium, swears he's seen the face of God. God help all those whose fever never raged or subsided. So already, this is the first canticle about zealotry, and you can see that it's like, well, wait a minute, what is he saying? Who's speaking here? Is this Soyinka? Is this a zealot? Who's he? He wakes from a prolonged delirium, swears he's seen the face of God. And then, God help anyone who hasn't felt that same sort of passion. Wow, interesting. And then immediately the quote from his novel when he was in prison, I need nothing, I feel nothing, I desire nothing. Okay, now I'm crossing my fingers that this will sound good. Can you hear that? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to the first time that Soyinka himself actually kind of speaks to the audience. And it's the movement is the fourth movement. I intend to be blunt.
Progressive insemination of fear as an agency of faith. It is no time for palliatives of speech and timorous euphemisms. As the poet Lansing McLoskey, generations of intolerance observes in one of his poems. There is no love in the world for
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to the 10th, actually, the 7th movement, the writing on the wall. And this shows, since we're all composers, some of what I'm talking about, multiple temporalities. So I have the singers and the ensemble in several different time signatures and tempos at the same time. Where am I? So you can see it starts off with string quartet, 4/4, quarter note equals 60. Then the soprano enters with the clarinet, and quarter note equals 69. So now the bar lines and the time signatures don't line up. As the piece goes on, then there's a cue. The viola leaves the string quartet, joins the soprano in their tempo, and then the mezzo-soprano joins. And then a while later, the violins join. And so you have several different tempos going on at the same time. And then the clarinet moves from the vocal at quarter note equals 69 into the accompanimental ensemble at quarter note equals 60. So there's a lot of, when you're doing this kind of thing, first of all, you cannot write this in Sibelius or Finale. That's why I am a Finale Sibelius lover, hater. In my opinion, I mean, I wrote this entire piece, 80 minutes, on paper. Because this kind of music, when you have an ensemble divided into different sections with different tempos, is impossible. It's not just difficult, it's actually impossible to notate and imagine that kind of music in a notation program, because Finale and Sibelius fight you. And so why would you use a composition tool that inhibits composition? So basically, I mean, they can be powerful tools, but I use them primarily as notation tools, not composition tools. That's another whole topic.
Just a quick question, if you don't mind. I just wanted to ask, are you managing this with multiple conductors, or how are you actually envisioning like the practical management?
I work out I call it the choreography. I mean, I do this in many pieces, including instrumental chamber works, and you have to think about like, okay, who's getting their tempo from where? Who's giving a cue to who? So sometimes the conductor's the one giving the cues, but sometimes it may be somebody in the wind section or somebody in the alto section or whatever who's actually giving the cue. So I work out the choreography very, very closely. And I try to avoid situations where they need a second conductor, because then that's a whole different level of logistics and practicality and all that. So in this case, no problem. The conductor keeps the main tempo. He's giving the various cues, and then the instrumentalists and the choir, I mean, they all have their part, which shows, okay, where am I getting Q3 from? Oh, etc. This text here is really, really powerful too. Well, yeah, just pay attention to the text, because I mean, I get choked up because it's here, it's now, it's not something far away on the other side of the world. It's also right here in our country on CNN. Okay, the next movement I'm going to play is The Dog in Dogma. And this is really Soyinka at his angriest, and really throwing, condemning intolerance and, the bad type of zealotry in every religion out there. So he really bashes everything. Intolerance and zealotry in Christianity, in Islam, in Buddhism, in Jewish, really. And so, this is a case, just as an aside, where it's a really angry text, and I decided to actually set it that way. So when I said earlier, don't just do the predictable. Well, that doesn't mean never do the predictable. It just means don't always do the predictable. Where am I? And now we're right in the middle of the piece. And this is the climax of the entire piece. And it's the one time that you hear the voice of the zealot explicitly. In one of Soyinka's speeches, he uses the phrase, "I'm right, you're wrong. I'm right, you're dead." And the difference is subtle and yet extreme, if you can be subtle and extreme at the same time. He talks about how, like, being convinced that you're right, it doesn't matter if it's political, you have a righteous cause, or if it's, let's say it's a religious belief. Anyone who's really committed to their spiritual perspective, their religious belief, of course thinks they're right. They believe they're right. And Soyinka says, you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. There's actually nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I believe in this religion. I believe that I'm right, and I believe everyone else is wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when you go from I'm right, you're wrong, to I'm right, you're dead. In other words, not just disagreeing with others, but actually viewing others with whom you disagree as less than, and ultimately not even worth living. My initial reaction, my instinct was to set it. I'm right. You're dead. That is so terrible, right? Of course, I'm going to set it so that the listener knows that it's terrible. And then I thought, well, following the dog and dogma, that would just be too obvious. So I completely changed the approach, and I set this text, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're dead, where the text is repeated over and over and over and over. And it's set as, well, actually, let me tell you a story. The baritone soloist was, when we showed up for the dress rehearsal, he was a little confused. He said, I have all the notes, the rhythms, but I don't really understand. I don't really understand what's going on. And I said, or what to do. And I said, sing it as if you're singing a love song to your own self-conviction. And then he just, his eyes opened wide and he said, oh, of course, now I get it. So that's really what it is. It's like you're singing a love song to your own self-conviction. And in a way, by the end, my intention was that hopefully the audience then doesn't just see the zealot as, Hitler, but actually starts to relate. And then at the end, you finally, you sort of wake up and go like, oh my God, wait, what? What was I just, that could be me. Or could it be me?
I am right. I am right. I am right.
Okay, two last movements, 15 and 16. I'll drop Ratsbane on your tongue just to show you some tutti writing. With the chorus and the whole ensemble.
I'll seal their fate in tunnels dark
I think now's a good time to pause before I talk briefly about something else and take comments, questions.
Yes, I have a question. One, the composer side of me and the sort of technician, just something I've noticed in a lot of the works that I've heard of yours, like regardless of the instrumentation, it always feels way huger than what it actually is. Like when I look at your scores, I'm like, that's all the instruments there are. And I was wanting to know about like what aspects of your process delivers that, as well as just like I just wanted to mention a quick observation about the zealousy and I was wondering through your process. I mean, a part of me, after really thinking about it, was starting to recognize an almost aspect of, and maybe this has to do with the musician or artist's environment, but a part that like almost fetishizes zealousy, this devout intensity, this obsession, and like that relationship. I mean, it was just an interesting like little thing I wanted to just like share out there that I'm definitely was really impacted in your piece. Like it was just something that I gotta like mull over in my head.
Oh, well, in that case, I succeeded. I mean, of course we write music, or, you know, one goal of writing music is to write something that, you know, people, it strikes them, either they enjoy it or what have you, but also, you know, if it gets them thinking, in my opinion, that's even more important. So you asked kind of a very complicated question. Actually, both your questions were complicated. I don't really know. I don't have a specific process like, gee, I have, you know, very limited sources here. How can I make it sound bigger? Although that is a goal. I mean, the opera that I just finished literally a couple weeks ago is for incredibly small forces. It's a quartet ensemble and 4 singers, and the opera is 105 minutes long. And I'm thinking, like, look, if I have a quartet, and it's an unusual instrumentation: percussion, clarinet, violin, and alto sax. I'm thinking, like, okay, violin, clarinet, alto sax, and percussion, 105 minutes, that can sound really predictable very quickly. I mean, you could end up 20 minutes in and be thinking like, I'm bored of this ensemble. Or not even I'm bored, it's like, I know this ensemble. Oh yeah, I know this ensemble. More clarinet and violin and saxophone, really? So I'm thinking all the time about orchestration. How can I make this really weird and limited ensemble not sound like a quartet of violin, clarinet, saxophone, and percussion? And so I'm thinking about register. I'm thinking about density. I'm thinking about, you know, ways to revoice, ways to rethink the ensemble. And I mentioned consideration of roles, like having the clarinet. I mean, you saw the clarinet have several different roles. The clarinet's a soloist, you know, a complementing or kind of commenting on what the singer or choir just did. It's also part of the ensemble, so sometimes it's just subsumed into the string quartet. Other times, like in that last movement, the 13th canticle, it is part of the choir. It's not part of the string quartet. It's not commenting. It's actually a voice. In that case, every single note of the clarinet is doubled in the choir, but never like, well, not never, but rarely 2 in a row. So it's taking the alto note, then the tenor note, and then the soprano note, then the alto note, and then the bass note. So you have a line but the line is never explicitly stated in the choir, but it's pulled out in the clarinet. And I think it makes it sound, maybe as you said, bigger, richer, denser. And then oftentimes it's sort of shadowing a soloist. So there's like one instrument, a clarinet, where I'm casting not just different notes and rhythms, but different roles. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is the listener is not able to then just take, oh, like the clarinet, and I can put the clarinet sound in this compartment. All of a sudden the clarinet is almost like is multiple clarinets, if you will, because it's functioning in different roles in the piece. Yeah, and I really, whether I'm writing for a large ensemble like wind ensemble or a chamber ensemble, I'm often thinking about orchestrally. I'm thinking like, how can this trio or how can this, sextet sound more expansive? So, but if you ask me like, well, hey, Lansing, how do you do that? Like, what do you do? What are the concrete, give me a handout on how to do that. I would be like, I'm not sure, I would say that, I don't know. I taught orchestration, of course, many times. And part of learning good orchestration is learning orchestration and then unlearning orchestration. In other words, if you always do what the orchestration books tell you work and avoid the things that don't work, well, then it's safe, but maybe it doesn't sound as big or it doesn't sound as unique, like, oh, never write for the bottom fourth or bottom fifth of the oboe because it's like squawky and they can't play soft and blah, blah, and it's hard to move around. And it's not like, that's not like oboe, territory. Oh, really? What if you explicitly write a whole oboe piece that only is the bottom fifth? All of a sudden, yes, it's challenging, and yes, it's some of the more difficult register and sound, but also really unique. So I don't know. And then as far as like the zealotry, I guess I don't know exactly how to respond to that other than, as I said, first of all, these are just such powerful words, not just poems, but his speeches and interviews. And I tried to set them in a variety of ways. So sometimes it's very declamatory. Sometimes it's a little sort of obtuse and like, what exactly, what's going on here? In a way that, so maybe, if I can musically either make the text even clearer or vague and open to interpretation, I think that's both successful. And it gives you, I think, a much broader and diverse and more sophisticated understanding of the text and the whole topic of zealotry and intolerance. I neglected to point out that this piece really was a sort of I wrote it during the election. And I had 19 movements done. And this is a period, of course, 2016, when we're turning on the TV and we're seeing people, our fellow citizens, not people in the Middle East or whatever, like our fellow citizens wearing hate-filled T-shirts and waving signs that are just straight up hate, intolerance. And you had a candidate who's encouraging violence, beat the shit out of the person, blah, blah, blah. So it was really disturbing. In a way, though, inspiring, since I was writing this piece already. I started it long before Trump was in the picture and all that. I had 19 movements finished, and then the election happened. And that was it. I couldn't compose. I called Donald Nally, in fact, and I said, you know what? What are we doing? I don't know if I can finish this piece. What's the point? What is the point of a big piece about tolerance when our country just elected the most intolerant person since, Andrew Jackson? And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed. I feel depressed. I feel like this is pointless. And Donald Nally said, I'm with you. I don't know. So I was going to end the piece with some sort of reconciliation, and I decided the only way to end the piece is with total depression, like we're doomed, there is no hope, we're effed, But I came back to it about a month later after not being able to compose a note and had a different ending, which you can listen to on Spotify if you care. But that moment, it changed the way I thought about what I was doing as an artist. I really couldn't. I felt like I couldn't write just an instrumental piece. I couldn't. That's why I said, like, who cares about my sax quartet? I felt like I can't just write a quartet that's just music for whatever, just cause. It's like, who gives a crap? And so most of my work in the past 3 years has been overtly political, or at least inspired. The piece that Transient Canvas played, Agitprop, is a good example. I wish we had been able to do it live, because you're all playing, streaming these files, and they're all speeches from 2,000 years ago in Rome, speaking out against oligarchy, against populism, or corrupt politicians who claim to be populist, but they're actually just, out to serve themselves and the wealthy and all this stuff. And then it's all manipulated, and it's a spectral piece. And then throughout the instrumental part, they quote fragments of Bach's chorale Es ist genug, which means it is enough, or enough already. And she plays the melody in multiphonics, and then I reharmed it. So it's got this chorale of enough with all these texts, and in a live, it starts to swarm or like percolate up around you. Now, and the thing about that is that for me, it's overtly political, but it doesn't have to just be done, during this presidency. I mean, it transcends. It's kind of an overused term, but my hope is that it has relevance whenever in 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, because those texts are 2,000 years old after all. So what's changed? I mean, this is a problem that we as humanity have been dealing with for millennia. So, sometimes we get caught up in the moment, like things really bad now, and they are, by the way. But guess what? Things have been bad off and on for a few thousand years, right? I mean, so I guess I can segue into how much time do we have? When did we go to?
6:30.
Okay, wait, 6:30, 3:30. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me do blah, 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 blah.
look, I'm not going to be rushed into having him testify so that he gets trapped into perjury. And when you tell me that, you know, he should testify because he's going to tell the truth and he shouldn't worry, well, that's so silly because it's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth. He didn't have a conversation.
Truth is
about,
truth. I don't mean to go like...
No, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth. The President of the United States says, I didn't.
Truth isn't truth. Mr. Mayor, do you realize what...
No.
This is going to become a bad meme.
Don't do this to me.
Don't do truth as a truth to me.
Donald Trump says, I didn't talk about Flynn with Comey. Comey says, you...
Oh.
Then I excuse, and you did not answer the question.
I did answer your question.
No, you did not. You did
Yes,
not
I
answer
did.
the question of why the president asked the White House press secretary to come out in front of the podium for the first time and utter a falsehood. Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office
No, it
on day
doesn't.
one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Alternative facts, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered. The one
Chuck,
thing he got right
Chuck.
was Zeke Miller. 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were just not true. Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
Chuck, do you think it's a fact or not that millions of people have lost their plans, their health insurance, and their doctors under President Obama? Do you think it's a fact that everything we heard from these women yesterday?
Alternative facts and truth isn't truth, composing an historical opera in the post-factual era. So the piece that I just finished is an opera, and so I don't have much to play, but let me just, I think it's worth talking about. Okay, here's, who is this? Well, this woman is named Hannah Duston. Wow, look, she's pointing her finger and she's got a pretty stern look on her face, okay? Hannah Duston was born in 1657 and died in 1630 or 1736 or 1737 or 1738. We don't know. Here's another statue of her. Big old thing. Here's a painting. That's her with in the middle with a hatchet. Here's another painting. That's her and getting in a canoe. Here's another woodcut. It's kind of hard to see the detail. Here's a little figure of her, a bobblehead, no less, of Hannah Duston. Mother's Revenge, okay. What's going on? Here's a whiskey bottle of Hannah Duston. There's another little figurine, kind of a Barbie. Barbie does Hannah Duston. So who is Hannah Duston? Raise your hands if you've heard of Hannah Duston. Okay, I can't see you all, but because I'm sharing. But let me tell you, most of you don't know who Hannah Duston is. I can guarantee. But a couple hundred years ago, all of you would have known Hannah Duston. Every single one of you. Here's the brief version. March 15th, 1697. Hannah Duston. So, you know, the very end of the 17th century. Hannah Duston is laying in bed because she'd just given birth a couple weeks earlier. And she's got like a bunch of other kids. Their village in it's Haverhill, but it's pronounced Haverhill, is attacked in New England, is attacked by Abenaki Indians. By the way, this is not, this is factual. This is the fact. Native American attacks on villages from the 17th century all the way through the mid 19th century were not uncommon. So that's also not open to dispute. That's a fact. But why they happen, where they happen, how they happen, and that's where we get into some maybe interpretation, complication, spin. So the Native Americans, the Abenaki, attack the village. They kidnap her and the infant and her handmaiden and flee, and they march off through the woods, kill the infant, smash it against a tree, and take her to this Indian village 100 miles away. She kills 10 of the Indians with a hatchet, escapes, flees in a canoe with her handmaiden, returns all the way to civilization, and is, there's a big hero's welcome. So none of that is open for dispute. This story of Hannah Duston turns out was written by many authors, famous American authors, some of the most famous. Cotton Mather, who was a famous priest and author, he interviewed Hannah after she returned. He gave a sermon that told her story, and she was in the audience. He published the story 3 times in different publications. Timothy Dwight wrote about it. Annette Hawthorne, Whittier, Henry Davish, typo, Henry David Thoreau. Okay, these are huge literary figures. They all wrote the Hannah Duston story. Sarah Josepha Hale, which again, you guys have probably not heard of her, but the reason we have Thanksgiving is because Sarah Josepha Hale, and she also wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. But anyway, she was a prominent, female figure during her time. Throughout the 19th century, okay, this happened when? 17th century, end of the 17th century. But in the 19th century, so 100 to 175 years later, her story showed up in every history book in the country, as well as biographies, magazine articles, and children's books. So if you were an American in 1840 or 1870, you knew the Hannah Duston story. There's 6 monuments that were built between 1861 and 1909. Notice that the first monument was 1861. Well, this happened in 1697. So why is there a 160-year gap? Well, there are reasons. But anyway, 6 monuments. Do you know who the first woman in America to have a statue erected in her honor is? I mean, it's Hannah Duston. So she was considered one of the most important women in American history during, certainly during the 19th century. Here's an example. Famous symbol of frontier heroism, a victim of an Indian raid, blah, blah, blah. After killing and scalping, okay, wait a minute, 10 Indians, she escaped. Here's another statue with some depictions of, the events. Coming back to this liquor bottle, I mean, my first question is like, okay, there's a whiskey bottle of Hannah Duston. What's with the boobs? I mean, really, a Puritan woman with the? So already, I think it's a little sexist, but this historic bottle, okay, and then if you look closely, what's in her hand? Scalps. So I'm pretty creeped out, She was revered in 1973. There was, a comprehensive history. The same year, the governor of New Hampshire writes this letter, praising Hannah as this model of bravery. Okay, and it's like the great American story, really, of valor and courage, and basically white woman. overcomes and slays bad pagan Indian captors. Well, truth isn't truth, alternative facts. This is where things get complicated. Turns out that, yes, the Abenaki attacked the village. Yes, they kidnapped her. Yes, they killed the child. But details matter and context matters. So it turns out that the the Abenaki tribe that kidnapped her, actually, they were Catholic, Roman Catholic. They had been converted by the French. And by the way, who did the French hate? The British, okay? And so we're talking, these were British citizens. So the whole New England area, and this actually continues for 150 years of American history, but it was really prominent during the colonial period, and where the white Europeans aligned themselves, often in mercenary ways, different Native American tribes to fight against each other in a fight against the other Europeans. So the French aligned themselves with certain tribes who then they encouraged to attack, the British. And the British did the exact same thing with different tribes. And oftentimes they were tribes that already hated each other. So we have this sort of, it's so complicated. We have this sort of, idea that, the Native Americans were, they lived all around the country in peace and harmony, when that is nothing, no, that is not true at all. Many of the tribes fought each other, long before the Europeans showed up, but then the Europeans showed up and of course totally exploited them. So this particular tribe had been converted to Catholicism. They prayed every day. Hannah herself says that. And, well, wait a minute. So who did the Puritans hate even more than pagans? The Catholics. So even though they were Christian, the Puritans, we also have this fake idea that the Puritans came over to America for religious freedom, and boy, how great they were. No, the Puritans were the frickin' Taliban of their time. One of the reasons that they left Europe is because they were so intolerant. They hated and were hated by other Christians, condemned them. So yes, they wanted to come to America to practice their religion and then tell everyone else that they couldn't practice their religion. So they were super intolerant. Also, it turns out that the 10 Native Americans that Hannah killed were asleep. So it wasn't some, courageous battle. She killed them in their sleep. They had treated her very well. She killed them in their sleep, and they were all women and children. Okay? So it wasn't some, this is not the Valkyrie, fighting the Native Americans. It's like killing women and children in their sleep. Then she escapes, and they get in the canoe, and then she turns around, goes back to the village, and scalps the 10. Well, why would she do that? She says, well, it's because I was afraid that if I got back to civilization, people wouldn't believe me. Really? They're not going to believe you? I mean, the village was attacked. People know that you were escaped. That makes no sense. 0 sense. How credible is that? That's truth isn't truth. So yes, she scalped them, but why? Well, could it have something to do with the fact that Indian scalps were paid large sums of money at the time? So when she came back and presented the scalps, she was paid a crap load of money. So you can see things get complicated, don't they? Who's the bad guy in the story? Who's the good guy? All through the 19th century, the Hannah Duston story was told and written everywhere. Why? Because that was the period when of American expansionism, and all along the way, they were running into Native Americans and having problems. So it was very useful to have propaganda of a white woman who was captured, a white Christian woman who was captured by the Indians and killed them and escaped. So that's why it was in history books. That's why it was in magazine articles all through the 19th century and in children's books to teach them Indians bad, they'll kidnap you. But look, there's hope. There's this, you know, this white Christian woman triumphed, even though they were Christian. So she even wrote, "I'm thankful for my captivity. 'Twas the comfortablest time that I ever had. In my affliction, God made his word comfortable to me." In other words, she was treated very well. In fact, in our research, we discovered that, yes, Native Americans did capture and kidnap white women from the 17th century through the 19th century. There's a long history of this. But you know what they don't tell you? 60% of the time, when white women were given the opportunity to escape or return to civilization, they declined. What? Why? It's because being a woman in 17th century Puritan society sucked. It was like the Taliban. Women, even the white women who were kidnapped, had much more respect and autonomy in the Indian culture, in the tribes, than they ever had in the European Puritan society. So 60% of the time, people chose not to return. That's pretty crazy if you think about it. Here's the statue, the sculpture, you know, and look at this statue, her missing the nose. Why do you think she's missing her nose? I'll tell you why. Because it's been shot off by vandals multiple times, repaired and then shot off again. It's graffiti, you know. A lot of these statues have been torn down, stolen, or graffitied. What are you so proud of? This is right in front of one of the statues of Hannah Duston. So you have protesters, particularly the Abenaki, but the Native Americans, who are questioning, you know, why are we praising Hannah Duston? She killed a bunch of women and children in their sleep, turned around and scalped them. You know, why are we celebrating this? On the other hand, did they attack the village? They kidnapped her, they killed her child. How would you respond? So what draws me to this story as a topic for an opera is that it's complicated. And each author that wrote the story, retells it, provides more facts so that, and a different perspective. So the early tellings are like, Hannah, white hero. But by the time you get to Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne says, it would be better, it would have been better if she had drowned in the river, sunk to the bottom, you know, with the scalps around her waist, never to be heard of, or lost in the woods and eaten by animals. So he really comes down harsh on Hannah. Where's the truth? I'm not going to tell you. I don't even know. But I can say it's complicated, which makes it a good topic for an opera and relevant today because over the centuries, the Hannah Duston story was used as propaganda. Many of the retellings, the facts are the same, but by omitting different facts, you give a different context, a different spin, right? So I felt like it was a perfect subject today when we live in the world of spin and like it's so hard sometimes to figure out like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, or maybe there's not a good guy and a bad guy. Maybe it's just complicated. You want answers, I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. So this piece was commissioned by Guerrilla Opera and the Barlow Endowment. And the first thing is like when you're dealing with a topic with something like this, with, you know, Native Americans, red flag, okay? Not just a little red flag, but a bigger red flag. In fact, There's not a huge red flag and lots of different red flags. I worked with the librettist Glenn Nelson in New York, fantastic author. Who's telling the story? Is it Hannah? Is it Cotton Mather, Hawthorne, Whittier, Thoreau? Dead white males, all four of them. Or is it Sarah Josepha Hale? Is it me, the composer, the librettist? Two more white males. So you've got like 6 white males telling the story of a woman and Native Americans. This is red flag territory. Kind of how to portray Native Americans. What is the story anyway? Is this her story? What's the point? One of the things we decided was to take different approaches. Like, so dealing with gender, for example. The opera tells the same story 5 times. So there's a prologue and an epilogue, but then the story of this kidnapping and escape is told 5 times through the lenses of these different authors. And the first act is pretty straightforward. Hannah's played by a soprano. Mary, her handmaiden, is the mezzo. Cotton Mather, I mean, he's a male, right? So of course he's cast by a male. And her husband is cast by is the bass. But then as the opera proceeds, things shift around. So in the second act, Hannah is a female. Her handmaiden, Mary Neff, is male. And Whittier, of course, who's a male, is played by a female. And then in the third act with Hawthorne, Hannah is not even in the story. And all the singers play different narrators. And then the fourth act is Thoreau, and all 4 cast members are Thoreau. So you have a soprano who's Thoreau, a bass who's Thoreau. And in the last movement, it's just 2 characters, Hannah and the narrator, who's a mezzo. And then the gender of other characters is constantly changing. So what this does is that, you're telling the same story 5 times. So by the end of Act 2, there's no surprises really to the audience, right? It's like, oh yeah, I know what happens. Well, do you? Because as the opera progresses, each act you get a different perspective. You get different facts. So after Act 1, you think you know what's going on, and it's pretty clear. Hannah's the hero, Indian's bad. But then by the time you reach the end of Act 4, you're like, wait, what? Who? Huh? Who's who? What's going on? Who am I believing? I'm empathizing now with different people. I'm empathizing with the Native Americans, but I'm also empathizing with Hannah. And then each act, as a singer enters the stage, normally in an opera, like, immediately 5 minutes in, oh, that's Madame Butterfly. It's not like, 45 minutes in, somebody walks on stage and it's a different person playing Madame Butterfly. That would be confusing, but it can also be interesting. And the first 2 acts were premiered actually a year ago. But that was just 25 minutes, so it's a 105-minute opera. And I just finished the entire thing just 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, really. And it's supposed to, the staged production is slated for this season in Boston by Guerrilla Opera. And Amy in Transient Canvas, she's one of the members of Guerrilla Opera, by the way. But unfortunately, I just got an email, like literally yesterday, that Guerrilla Opera's entire season is up in the air, most likely canceled. So now we have to have a Zoom meeting next week to figure out, what's going to happen. I mean, you guys all know that of course, society, the economy is being hammered, but classical music, and particularly new music, is suffering more than any other area. So a lot of new music presenters, organizations, venues, and ensembles, including orchestras, new music chamber ensembles, opera companies, are all going to go belly up. I mean, that's fact. So we're all sort of freaking out. I'm definitely freaking out that I've spent, again, 2 years writing an opera that was scheduled to be premiered this season, and now the entire thing is up in the air. I do have a video of the first, the prologue and Act 1. Don't really have time to play I don't know if I should even play any of it, or we should just talk. Who's got questions? Comments?
Can I ask?
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. I'll do that. Yeah, for sure. If I can find it. Go ahead.
So does the opera not have any characters who are Native American?
Oh, excellent question. Early on in the process, the librettist and I and the artistic directors, there's 2 artistic directors of Guerrilla Opera, both women, by the way. And they were really helpful in helping us figure out how to deal with this very sensitive issue. And I should say that we have reached out to and involved the Abenaki Indians in this project. So they're aware of it, because the last thing we wanted is to have an opera going to be premiered in Boston, and all of a sudden there's protesters because the Abenaki representatives think that we're praising Hannah. So they know what's going on, that we are taking a very holistic view, that we're not telling the audience what to think, and we're trying to provide context and different perspective. But early on, one of the first decisions that everyone came to is that we are not going to depict the Native Americans in the opera at all. I mean, that's a no-win situation. I'm sorry. It's just a no-win. And it's not necessary. Like, we don't need to depict the actual captivity and have people dressed in Native American garb rushing in and dragging her. I mean, it's just like, it was so fraught with problems that we decided to abandon that. And it doesn't really need it for the drama or the story to work anyway. But that's an excellent question. And one of the things that we discussed early on too, particularly with the 2 women artistic directors, is like, hey, all these authors you're talking about, they're all dead white males. How are you going to deal with this? So we had to do a research to find this text by Sarah Josepha Hale, which is interesting because, she's a woman. You think she'd be more sympathetic to Hannah, and no, it's like she's kind of the worst. In fact, her whole approach praises the bravery of Hannah's husband, because he took the 8 other children and protected them and fought the Native American attack and took them to this small fortress. So Sarah Josepha Hale, a woman, does not take a very feminist view, unfortunately. But
Lansing, a quick question. Regarding political activism in music, and it's often I've seen often in traditional protest song that the most effective thing is you go with your guitar and go place by place, and your you're saying fits in a bumper sticker, right? Whether
Yeah.
poetic or not, it is.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
United can, will never be defeated, or anything that's short, clear, and whose the purpose is to convince people of all of the things that you're trying to convince them to do. But the genres we both, I mean, you and I live in, delve on complexities and ambiguities, and it's very hard to, and also a much narrower audience, right? So how do you operate thinking the need of sending your message out with the restrictions of our genre of contemporary classical music that are, for educated audiences that are typically small, and the thing that we are thoughtful, and you are incredibly thoughtful in this, rather than blunt in trying to convince others the fastest possible way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Boy, I had a conversation with one of the students a couple days ago that touched upon this too. There are times when having a picket sign with a slogan, like a bumper sticker thing that's concise, unambiguous, and to the point is appropriate. So I do that at times. I think Agitprop is more of a picket sign kind of piece. And another recent piece is a chamber, again, no text. It's a chamber work I wrote for, well, it doesn't matter. And the title is The Task Ahead is Enormous and time is short. It's a recent quote from just a year ago by Noam Chomsky. I don't say what it's about, but the title itself is like a bumper sticker, and the piece is kind of, in your face. Who's going to a concert of Agitprop or my Noam Chomsky piece? A new music audience, okay? And they're gonna get it, right? An opera or my oratorio, I knew that's a different audience. Yeah, okay, there's new music people. But I felt like those kind of larger scale pieces with a different demographic, a broader demographic of listener, needed to be more nuanced and I guess, complicated. These are complex issues. And so neither in Zealot Canticles or in Hannah Dustin was I really interested in telling people this is bad or this is how I want you to think. That's why I think in Zealot Canticles, some of the most, in my opinion, the most compelling parts are those movements where, as a listener, hopefully you're going, huh? Whoa, I don't quite know what to make of that. And as far as like the Hannah story, I don't know what to make of it. That's the thing. I think it's so, even though it happened in the 17th century and it was used as propaganda in the 19th century, I think it's really relevant today, not because of the topic. I mean, there are no more Native American attacks on villages, right? But because it's an example of a historical event that was understood in different ways by different people because of different spins, different omissions of facts. And look, if you turn, I'm sure you guys have watched a lot of television in the last 3 weeks. I flip back and forth between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and I'm watching the same protest or the same killing or the same whatever told, and it's the fact, none of usually they're the same facts, and yet you have a completely different understanding. If you only watched MSNBC or if you only watched Fox, you only have one understanding of what's happening in our country. But that's not the truth, is it? It's much more nuanced. And so that's why I thought this story was so relevant. And also, to be totally honest, I don't even know what to make of it. I'm a parent. I totally relate to Hannah. But I also relate to the more woke view, the Abenaki perspective. It's like, hey, man, they were Christian. They treated her kindly. She killed a bunch of women and children and scalped them in their sleep. I mean, come on. This is something we're supposed to praise? Give me a freaking break. So for me, that's more interesting. It's much more interesting. And I think in a way more, I love Zhevsky, right? Because he doesn't mince words. He's just like, this is how I feel. F, whatever, the man. But that's not, and I relate to that. I think there's a need for that, but that's not what I'm trying to do in these pieces. I don't know. Are there some works of Wole Soyinka that you could recommend? Ooh, there are several, any of the collection, there are different collections of his poetry. They're all good. You can't go wrong. One novel, the one he wrote in prison, is called The Man Died. For me, that's the one that really just, wow. I might start with that. It's not his best work because, and I think he would probably admit, because it's like, he wrote it in prison, so it's very disjunct and it's scattered, and there's not a lot of there's not a through line, but you really get a mindset of like, wow, this was written by somebody in in horrific circumstances, and it's talking out, speaking against the abuse of power, and it's also personal, and yeah, so that's a great one. And just Google speeches. I mean, there's so much out there, and some of his speeches and interviews are as powerful as any of his poetry. I think we're out of time. So I'm sorry. I always end up, I end up talking too much. I should have played more of played some of the opera, but I gave a link there, and so thank you all. And of course, I'm happy to take questions now or later. You all know how to contact us. So, all right. Thank you all. And I'll see some of you tonight. I think 3 or 4 of you.